Welcome everybody. I was told we need to start on time because apparently we are on TV, so we have to follow a very tight schedule. Good morning and welcome to one of this morning's sessions. Today we'll be talking about migration. And I know what many of you are thinking right now. Isn't migration so 2016? Well, actually, I hate breaking it to you, but just when it seemed that Europe's migration problems were behind us, they have bounced back with a vengeance. But right now, they have much less to do with the number of people arriving in Europe than they do with the emotive politics of migration. Even though irregular arrivals, and I'm sure that you all know this, are at the lowest level in 5 years, and they're actually down by 90% since the peak of the migration crisis in 2015, European citizens still say that they are more worried about migration than they are about, say, crime, climate change, or the economy. So the fact that there is such a difference in between numbers and citizens' attitudes towards migration suggests that something else is at work here. Well, that something else is populist, nativist parties across Europe, but also the US, who are basically tapping into voters' concerns and fueling them further. On the face of it, citizens, you, me, the panel, are faced with a binary choice. Either vote for those who think that the only way to control migration is to stop it altogether, or actually move all the other way to the other side of the spectrum, to those criticizing Europe as little more than a fortress. There is no coherent migration narrative coming from the middle ground, political center, and that is, to me, one of the biggest challenges we are facing at the moment. And yet, in the face of this politics of emotions, the biggest challenge for both political but policymakers as well is to actually come up with migration policies which are not only effective, but they're also workable, and they are, most importantly, sellable to their voters. The European Union hasn't been particularly good at that. I know that this is a controversial thing, and I know that the panel will probably have different opinions than I do on this one. Of course, the European Union has been good if we measure results by number of arrivals. We have lowered the number of arrivals. But thinking only in short-term arrival terms, we're basically denying the reality, which is that people will come to Europe no matter what. A new EU administration is taking office very soon, in a couple of months, if everything goes according to plan, and migration will most probably be one of the first issues they will have to tackle heads-on, Brexit notwithstanding. Ursula von der Leyen, Commission President, and her team will have to answer really tough questions from the beginning of their mandates, and those include how can we solve the European Union's migration and asylum deadlock, how can we capitalize on legal migration schemes which are good both for host societies and sending countries, and how to improve Europe's relationship with Africa. Now, while we wait for them to take office and answer all these questions, I'm really happy that we've put together this amazing panel of speakers coming from pretty much all over the world, actually, and from different walks of lives. So I'm going to introduce them now. I have a very tough task today, so bear with me here, because I've never chaired an event with 7 panelists plus a keynote listener, which I'm going to explain. I'm going to explain what it is in a moment. So if you forgive me, I will just introduce the panelists. You have the bios in the newspaper that the organization has circulated, so I'm not going to make it very long. Now I'm going to start by my far left. We have Matteo Villa, and Matteo is a research fellow for Europe and global governance, business scenarios, migration for the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Matteo, I'd like you to talk about legal migration schemes in a second. Then we've got Shara Islam. Shara Islam works for Friends from Europe in Brussels, and I know that she likes to spice things up. So I'm going to bring her in to talk about migration and populism. Now His Eminence Cardinal Peter Kodo Apaya Tarkson, and that's a very long name, is the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development at the Vatican, so I hope that he can bring in the Catholic community's views, but perhaps also, given his Ghanaian origin, the voice of the African continent, which is so often neglected in these debates. On my right, I have the Honorable Minister Carmelo Abela, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malta. As you know, a very important state when it comes, member state when it comes to the European Union's migration conundrum. Minister, I will be asking you about Malta's approach to dealing with migrants and refugees at the moment. Ms. Nina Gregory, she is Slovenian, so she's at home, but she is most importantly the Executive Director of the European Asylum Support Office in Malta as well. And Nina will be asking you about EASO's role on several of the, let's say, political incidents we had this summer, but also perhaps about the future of the agency, one of the most important agencies when it comes to migration in Europe. Now, Ms. Karin Kneis, so sorry. She was, until recently, a Minister for Foreign Affairs in Austria, Austria being also one of the key players of migration sort of like dialogues in Brussels, as you very well know. And I hope that you can talk a little bit about the internal and external dimensions of migration and how Europe is dealing with that. And last but not least, Amélie Jacques App. She's the young, bled strategic foreign representative. And I will hopefully bring you in to talk about brain drain, but also communication and how can we make migration communication a bit better. Now it's time for me to shut up because you haven't come here to listen to me. But before that, I'm going to just explain you how the next 90 minutes are going to pan out. So as I said before, I have my hands full, so you have to help me, all of you, panelists and the audience. I'm going to use 40 minutes, 45 minutes to actually have a conversation with the panelists. I don't want this to become a presentation-only panel, so I'm gonna make it as interactive as I can by bringing participants as we go, and hopefully by bringing some questions which are interesting for everybody. Once the panel section is over, I will open the floor to the audience, and I will open the floor to the audience with a very innovative figure, which I've never had before, but I think is very interesting, and that's Martijn. Martijn Plum is ICMPD, Director of Migration Dialogues in Vienna. And Martijn, I will ask you for your takeaway of the discussion before opening the floor to participants, perhaps with a comment on what you think has been discussed here. I will then open the floor to the audience, and then we'll have some concluding remarks coming from the panelists, and if we have the time, which I doubt we will, I will do some very short wrap-up. So without further ado, let me start with the Honourable Minister here on my rights. Mr. Abela, you serve in the government of a frontline member states. Your country, Malta, which has under 500,000 population, has received this year, if I'm correct, around 1,600 people by sea, more or less.
Close to 1,900.
Close to 1,000, okay, so around 2,000, let's say. This might seem like a tiny figure if we compare it especially to the 1 million people that entered Europe in 2015. But as a measure of comparison, Italy, which has 60 million people, received around 5,300 people by sea this year. So these are actually huge figures for a tiny country. And I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit more of how Malta deals with this question? And also, what would Malta like to see coming from Brussels to actually help with this issue?
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning to everyone. I think that we are talking about an issue, which is migration, that is not new. Migration exists till the existence of human beings. Maybe it shifts from time to time. Even if I take as an example the history of my immigration in my own country, until a number of years ago we used to have Maltese leaving the country to go elsewhere. Now the circle is joined by being a country of receiving immigrants rather than people leaving the country. So I think we have to realize that we're not talking about a new phenomena. This exists since the existence of human beings. The issue is how to deal with such a situation. Maybe what annoys people most is how migration is happening, which is in a irregular, illegal, not structured way. That might be something that annoys, let's say, the vast majority of our population. We have to say also that there is a criminal activity going on behind all this. There is exploitation of these persons that are leaving their respective countries, either because of political instability or for reasons that they feel threatened. But there are a number of migrants that are leaving their country because of lack of opportunities, so for economic reasons, as we usually say. Now, my country is one of the countries in the front line of the European Union. We are centrally located in the Mediterranean, and now the, let's say, most popular route for migration towards Europe is the Mediterranean route, mainly leaving from North Africa, especially Libya, and we know Libya, the current state of play from a political security point of view, lack of instability. So it makes it even more difficult to try to work with the local authorities on this. So we are there, and we have to deal with a number of boats, a number of situations, let's say, on a daily basis. So how we deal with that? I think first and foremost there are international rules, regulations, conventions, and all the rest, which we comply with all of them. But there is also human decency, because after all, you mentioned the figures. This year, approximately 1,900 disembarkations happened in my country. But we are talking about human beings. So the first priority as humans is to save lives. And then the issue of course, where to disembark and what to do with migrants. I think if someone expects that my country, which is 316 square kilometers with a population of just a little bit less, 500,000, solves the migration challenge in the Mediterranean, when we know that there are about, let's say, 600 to 700,000 migrants awaiting in Libya, only in Libya, ready to cross. And God forbid, if things go even worse in Libya, you might end up having a larger number of people, especially Libyans, also leaving their country. So I think that it is impossible for us as a country to solve the migration challenge, especially from that route. So what we have been asking to our European Union friends, and we have been dealing with the situation of migration since the year 2000, most of the time on our own at that time, then of course Italy, which is a country which is a neighbor to us as well. But we were struggling to convey the message to the European Union, at least in the beginning of the year 2000, when all this started, at least from this route. Then, little by little, a number of EU member states were being also receiving migrants. So it became an issue for not just one or two countries, but for others as well. We have structures, and since then these structures evolved. EASO is one of them. But I think that we need to join the dots as well. What I see is lacking now is political will within the European Union to agree on how to deal with the situation of migration from an internal perspective. Because from the external side, the external point of view, that is to invest in third countries, to work with third countries and countries of not only of origin but also countries of transit, and to try to help the local population to have stability, democracy, but also education and give possibilities to the younger generation, which in Africa is the vast majority. I mean, 60% of the population is under the age of 35 or 30 years old. So we are talking about human capital, resources that, if we want to look at it that way, that need to expand their potential, and definitely there is much potential in that. So we were struggling since this time to try to have a holistic approach to migration, which I don't think that we have. And I explain what I mean by this, because we have a number of European member states that need more workers. And we have potentially migrants coming to us, which up to a certain extent can be seen that these are also potential workers in our economies, but we are not tackling this issue, let's say, from a broader perspective. But we are saying, well, we have a problem, migrants are coming, maybe there is the issue of security. Yes, we need to take care of security, we need to guard our borders better. But then we have a situation that we have to deal with it when migrants come to Europe. So the issue of disembarkation will be the first one to tackle, then what to do with the migrants, especially if we as a country, as I said, almost 1,900 just this year, and we have a number of migrants that are living in Malta either because they are in the process of the asylum process or they received some kind of protection. So it's not just the 1,900 that disembarked this year, but also from previous years. So it is a challenge for us, and that is why we need that there will be responsibility sharing or burden sharing, call it what you like, but maybe responsibility sharing sounds more, sounds nicer. And how to also share this with other member states by relocation or some kind of other programs. So I think every EU country needs to be part of the solution to manage migration. I don't think that migration is a European Union issue only, but it is a global challenge. And that is why I was happy that also the United Nations did what is called the Compact for Migration. Controversy around this as well, but you know, we live in a world where controversy maybe is part and parcel of our daily life. But I believe that it was a good thing that the UN got involved in this, because migration is a global challenge, and I think likewise we should tackle this challenge of migration to try to manage, because unless human beings will continue to live in this planet, I think migration is going to be with us as well.
Absolutely, Minister. Thanks so much for those words. You mentioned several things that I think bring us directly to somebody who was at a member state government not that long ago as well. You said the European Union needs every single member state to work on its migration problem, because no single member state can solve the migration conundrum by itself. But you also mentioned that we have been relatively good at solving the external dimension, but we need now to find agreement on the internal dimension. And I was wondering, Ms. Neisel, sorry. You have been recently the Minister of Foreign Affairs for your home country of Austria, who, as we know, has been an open critic of EU migration policies, not for a long time, since 2014-2015, but it has been an open critic of the ways the European Union has been dealing with its migration problems. Some argue that the inability or that the fallout of the 2015 refugee crisis could have been averted if the European Union had been better at actually linking the internal and the external dimension of migration policy, say being able to forecast that what was going on in Libya and Syria was going to have such a big impact in the European Union, but also on things like, can you put together pull and push factors like what's going to happen with, you know, like climate, immigrants, but also what's going to happen with peak oil and all this sort of like things that we don't necessarily talk that much about. So as a minister, as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, what's your take on that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Well, I was asked in autumn 2017 to join government as an independent expert minister. Expert in what? Expert in international relations, energy politics, and let me start by a course I was teaching on geopolitics of the oil market in Angola in 2015 spring, when the oil prices had already crumbled from above $120 to less than $30 per barrel. That meant for a country like Angola, which is the second largest oil producer on the African continent, that in particular in the offshore drilling, where you need where you have higher exploration costs. So when the price had gone below $40, there was a tremendous rise in closing down exploitation of oil and of offshore oil. That meant that there was a reverse in migration. Between 2004 and 2014, you had more Europeans going to Angola than Angolans leaving for Europe. For the simple reason that it was a bonanza that we had in Angola, like we had a bonanza at certain periods in the Persian Gulf countries and elsewhere, where you could make quick and easy money, work there for 6 months, 18 months, make enough money. And I've seen a lot of, in particular, people from Spain, from Portugal, even also descendants of the former colonial farmers who were there, who mostly came, of course, from Portugal, but also from Spain. There were lots of engineers saying, let's do quick and easy money. We know the mentality. We can tackle that. So you had this tremendous migration flow from Europe to a country like Angola, and Luanda was the second most expensive city on the globe after Tokyo because of all these evident reasons. Now with the decline in the oil market as of 2014, against all odds, despite the fact that there was a geopolitical crisis in all versions, whether it was Daesh in Syria and Iraq, whether it was the Ukrainian transfer gas problem, etc. But the oil price went down for various reasons. There was this oversupply of oil and there was a tremendous decline in demand, in particular because of Chinese less buying oil on the global market. So all that led to a reverse in migration. We had, for instance, when you take 2015-16, who were the majority of people who tried to get from Libya into Italy or Malta. It was not Libyans, it was not people from North Africa, like we had in the 80s and 90s, before the Barcelona project of 1995, then also directed by Spain, France, and Italy. It was all about migration in 1995, especially under the Spanish leadership then. And we had in 2016 mostly people coming from South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, but in particular from Bangladesh, who tried to cross from Libya into Europe. Why? Because they had just lost their employment in the Gulf. They had been working in construction, in oil exploration fields in the Gulf countries. And with the recession of the oil market, people went further west. So that was, in a nutshell, the new dimension of the breaking down of the commodities market. When you remember in the early 1980s, when the commodity market broke down then, Dutch disease, because people were so much focusing on commodities, forgot about other parts of their economy, that hit not only the Southern Hemisphere, it also hit important commodity producers in Western Europe. And in those days, we had a tremendous debt crisis, which is still hitting the economy of those countries, but we did not yet have the migration factor. In today's interconnected world, it's a commodity decline is affecting both the debt situation of these countries and migration. So this is I would say, one of the many factors apart from demography, apart from conflicts. Conflicts you can solve. You can make an armistice agreement, you can stop a war, but you cannot stop demography and you cannot handle the overall economic situation by where supply and demand are the masters of the game. We are in today's European decision-making world, whether it's elections in Germany or in Austria, it's all about the environment, climate change, and fossil energy. We like to see ourselves as moving into a new era of an energy supply, but we should not forget the implications that new era will have in geopolitics for the fossil producers. We have seen a pre-taste of that in 2014, 2015, and I think the implications will be much harsher when you have an overall change. And we should not forget about all those ramifications, because it's so easy to say in the Northern Hemisphere, well, we have to move out of oil, and this is the right way. But on the other hand, forgetting about what is happening in the oil and gas producing countries, which for most are located in the Southern Hemisphere. Not exclusively, thinking of Norway, thinking of Russia, etc., but mostly they are located in the Southern Hemisphere. So to put all those dots together, as Minister Abela has also said, of course you have to have people who are able to think in the larger picture, who are able to go beyond an ideological framework they are sometimes a little bit imprisoned inside, and get it. And I myself, having attended lots of commodity conferences as an analyst in 2014-15, we were all aware of that fact. But unfortunately, the desire to act and to really have a dialogue on that, whether it's in EU fora or elsewhere, was not there. And what I saw as Minister of Foreign Affairs together with my colleague at the council meetings, and I was never involved in the council meetings on migration as such, because I didn't serve as Minister of Interior, but maybe it's there a different situation in the councils of foreign affairs. What we miss is real dialogue. It's a unilateral reading out of talking points, which I found quite shocking, because this has nothing to do with diplomacy, the way I understand it, the way I learned it and I was teaching it, and the way I practiced it 30 years ago when I was a junior diplomat. So here we have today an over-bureaucratization, an over-technocratic approach to international relations. There is no more dialogue in the true sense of that word, which means interacting, looking, for instance, into each other's eyes, because people are fixed on their smartphone, on their iPad when they enter the council room, and there is no interaction, there is no true preparation of the council meetings, and I do hope with a new commission, with a different approach, that might change, but this is one of the malaise that we have in the European decision-making.
Thanks so much. I don't think that's exclusive of the foreign affairs ministers, but I think that happens at lower levels as well, I'm afraid. You said something really interesting, which is that you can stop conflicts on paper, at least, but you cannot stop demography or the economy. Like drawing a parallel with that, in this new sort of like crisis of emotions that we have at the moment, you can't stop arrivals because you can, close borders or close down the ports, or at least like bring them down to the minimum, but you cannot stop the emotions which go with the whole politics of migration. And this brings me to the latest tactics of some politicians in Europe who are trying to do precisely that, stop arrivals altogether. And I'm thinking of a certain Mr. Salvini, whose tactics of actually refusing migrants at sea have been rather controversial. I was wondering, His Eminence, you represent the Catholic community, and again, perhaps a voice of the African community as well in this panel. And I was wondering, what do you make of these tactics? Can we really morally ignore search and rescue missions on the basis that they are actually acting as a pull factor?
Well, thank you, moderator, and good morning to all of you. I'd like to acknowledge the input of the two previous speakers who've, kind of exposed the topic. It's clear that the thing is international. It's clear that the thing has a dimension which, the Ambassador Malta, the Minister of Malta refers to as humanitarian or some. The position of Salvini in this case, I think from the part of the Vatican, we recognize that Salvini has a role to play. He's been elected by a country, by its population to play a role. And, as a political figure elected, feels that he needs to respond to some of those needs. So we cannot floor him on what he does and what he says. We can only invite him to widen the perspective and the scope of his consideration and reflection. Ours is not to condemn Salvini for not wanting to take in migrants and all, Ours is simply to invite Salvini to consider a wider scope, a wider context, as the Minister of Austria just said. Therefore, for us, the issue of migration is double-fold. It's clear from all the interventions so far that migration is a phenomenon of humanity. Human history has always had migrants. There's no community in the world which cannot count migration as part of its history. This is very clear. In 2015, when Pope Francis was in the United States speaking to the House of Congress, he said all of us are children of migrants. He himself, being of Italian descent, and most Americans who have migrated from Europe into the United States, we are all children of migrants. So at what point does migration become an issue, and at what point does it not become an issue? When the Vietnam War ended, we used to talk about refugees of Vietnam to the United States, and there nobody used the word migration. It was refugees. And when we talk about refugees, we talk about people seeking, moving away from what threatens their life to the type of the situation where their lives will be promoted. And something similar is about migration. From our own observation then, migration, the areas from which people migrate a lot of time, except for the situation that was presented by the ambassador to Austria, where Portuguese are moving to Angola because of Angola's oil boom and diamond and all of that, because Portugal at that point also was in economic crisis and all of that. So that is to be understood. But most of the migrants now are coming from war-torn areas or economically depressed areas. Afghanistan, Syria, Damascus, all of these are from war-torn areas. So the question, how did the wars begin? Who began it? Who stokes the wars? And who provides the ammunition with which the wars are being fought? Recognizing the fact that these countries do not have really armament factories. Most of the arms which are used in this conflict come from the countries which now do not want to receive them. A big campaign that was made the other day so Salvini was about, look at Sardinia, produce a lot of landmines. For whom? And all the armament are produced for whom? Macron says that he's happy to be a child of post-war Europe. And the European Union was put together so that European states do not fight against each other anymore. Why then do all of these countries possess serious armament industries? Where do they go? Arms have become economic commodities, which are sold, and we do not consider the impact and the consequences of these arms. So that is from Afghanistan, from Syria, from all of that. These are people from conflict-ridden areas who are seeking refuge, who are seeking to protect their lives. Caused by what? Caused by conflict. Conflict waged by what? Waged by armament produced from somewhere. We need to consider all of that. I'm not saying for that matter that everybody, therefore, Europe should open its borders to everybody. But it's the same. You come to a certain part of the Mediterranean from Africa. A lot of it is economic migrants, as they call them, issues. Well, look at the El Dorado in the United States. That was an economically motivated migration. People in search of gold, people in search of wealth. So the type of things which make human beings move are diverse. And at the end of it, it's always something to ensure and to save the lives of people. That is the bottom line. So I would invite, just as I would for Salvini and so for the audience here, the issue of migration invites us to look a little bit further beyond the movement of people. Migration is not about statistics, it's about human beings, as the minister to Malta just told us about. If it's about human beings, the issue of migration is not just people on the move, but it's a question of humanity. When somebody, needed person stands before you, it's not first and foremost a case of abandonment, but how do you ensure his own sense of humanity? Migration, it's also about our own fears. What are the fears we are addressing and dealing with in the issue of migration? Some of them are referred to as ideological, some of them are referred to as, but we're dealing with the issue of also fears within people. Migration, what is it about? It's about our own challenge to being charitable to the needy and those who are in need. So we can go on and widen the scope of migration, which for us as a church invites us to look more at issues that challenge humanity to be humane. When in the past, and this will be my last point, when in the past we talked about globalization, we talked about how communication systems were uniting humanity, were bringing us all together. But there we observed already that globalization brings us together, but it has not quite made us into brothers. We brought together, but we don't feel brotherly towards each other. So we were brought together to exploit the economic gains of globalization, but not to accept the responsibility of being brotherly and showing concern for one another. That's also what we invited now to do with the issue of migration. So we want to thank the European Union for what it's done so far. And as we've always said, migration invites us to do two things. We do not have to limit ourselves to mopping the water that is falling off the tap. We should also try to turn off the tap. If we don't learn to turn off the tap, we shall be forever mopping water. The issue of migration is that Europe is already helping to deal with the situation, but we should also find a way of turning off the tap. Stop the tap of things in Africa, in the Far East, which cause people to move. We need to turn off the tap and not limit ourselves to simply mopping the water that is falling out of the tap. Thank you.
Thank you. I think many ministers and prime ministers share that view, but probably not from the same kindness of heart, if I may. Nina, we just heard praise for the European Union. His Eminence just said we thank the European Union for everything that it has done to help migrants. And your agency, the agency you head, EASO, has done a lot to actually help migrants and asylum seekers in their quest for basically to find a better life. Specifically, you've been involved in all the operations of disembarkation that have happened in recent times in Italy and Malta, 11 if I'm correct. You've developed a lot of expertise, you've put together best practices, and yet this is not really a systematic approach, is it? You're still lacking some sort of a long-term vision of how this disembarkation, which was touted as, the major breakthrough for the migration crisis some months ago, is going to work. So what's your take on that?
Thank you very much for the invitation, first for the floor, of course, and good morning to everyone. Yes, it's debate on migration, always so invigorating, and it cannot stop. And the conclusions, are always those who go are driving us to the future, of course, and also to the future thinking. So I'm really glad that I can be a part of this panel. But in fact, as you said, dear Camina, of course, the EASO being a support agency, the agency who supports the member states in the field of asylum is the agency which really delivers very concrete work and very concrete results. So in this respect, I can only say that when we talk about the agency's three pillars of work, definitely we're trying to achieve together with the member states fast and efficient asylum procedures. I think this is something that's usually in a way is overlooked or is not really, we don't even talk about in depth about this situation. But I think when we talk about numbers, we see that currently we have around 900,000 people who are waiting for the end of asylum procedure in Europe. But even when we talk about the flows, we see that in fact in 1 year we have 4 times in numbers, of course, more people who are in asylum procedure than those who are irregularly crossing European Union's border. So in that respect, I think that the obligation of the member states to conduct, as I said, fast and efficient asylum procedure is enormous. Because in fact, people who are not getting, the situation and solved in in a quick time, then of course they are inside of European Union. They are moving from one country to another. They, of course, there are security issues. There are also issues, in fact, which then cause these, I would say, political disputes, but also the member states who, in fact, or the politicians who are using this situation, saying that, of course, migration is only a negative narrative. But back to the concrete question, yes, definitely EASO is, of course, supporting the member states also now with this current debarkation. We are doing very operational work on the ground in Italy and in Malta, and we are trying to help those member states with the registration of those who are arriving to Europe, and then, of course, we conduct the pre-interviews procedures, the interviews, and then we try to connect those people who have arrived with the member states who are willing to relocate them on their own territories. The coordination is currently done from the side of European Commission. And if you ask me for the sustainability of the system, I can only say that no, the system is not sustainable. It is help, I would say, in a certain kind of way. There are political circumstances with the disembarkation, of course, because there are only few member states, currently Malta and Italy, who are facing this challenge, and they have their political positions on that. And of course, if this is not going to be solved in a way in the bigger picture, so if this isn't going to be the salvation from the side of all the member states, from the new commission, from the parliament, from all the stakeholders, I don't think that, in fact, neither the EASO, neither the first line member states can really make the system work in the long run. It is also, I would say, the question of responsibility and also the question, of course, of solidarity among the member states. And I do hope that, of course, with the new commission, this, I would say, the debate in Brussels will go, will start again and will get new impetus, for sure.
Thank you, Nina. We all hope. I think we are actually putting a lot of pressure on the new commission to come up with solutions to this very tricky question. Obviously, the work that EASO has been doing this summer has been partially in response to the crisis of the open arms, which, as you know, is an NGO, Spanish NGO actually, search and rescue vessel, which was stopped from coming to Italy by Mr. Salvini yet again. This brings me to Shara. Mr. Salvini, Mr. Orban, and others have tactics that many among us, me included, might qualify as despicable. But they are actually efficient. They are working for them internally. They are giving them votes, but they are also giving them sort of an upper hand when it comes to pushing their agenda at the European Union level. No previous Italian politician has been able to sort of like bang the table in Brussels to get what Italy has been asking sotto voce for a long time on migration as Salvini has. It pays off to be loud these days on migration questions. Obviously, these are the wrong answers, but I can't help wonder whether the populists are giving the wrong answers, but I think maybe not asking the right questions.
Thank you very much, Camino, and it's great to be back at the Bled Strategic Forum. I was here last year and I really enjoyed it, so it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here and obviously the view. So Camino, are they asking the right questions? Is Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Viktor Orban, Matteo Salvini, do they ask the right questions? The short answer I'll give you is no. First of all, they're not asking questions. We are the ones who are asking questions. They're making inflammatory statements. And they may be visibly strong men, but I think they're really weak inside. Banging on the table is not the way to get things done. You're destroying the soul of Europe, as His Eminence has pointed out. So their statements, what are they based on? They're based on false numbers, erroneous information, and actually helped by a very pliant media, which is not asking, I believe, I used to be a journalist, the right questions, not holding power to account as they should be doing. My long answer, if I may, is really about context. Now, the migration debate, as the ministers and His Eminence and Nina have said, is not taking place in a vacuum. It's taking place in a context where we have, at the moment, a very toxic discourse, a racist discourse, a discriminatory discourse on people who are deemed to be the other. We are talking in an environment where the entire conversation by these so-called strong men is about us and them, cleavages, differences between us, humanity being divided. With this conversation is taking place in a very changing world environment. Power, economic power, political power is moving from the West, from the white continents, to the East, to the brown people, to the Chinese people. And this is creating a lot of resistance and fear and concern among white populations. We have the so-called replacement theory that I think has been, of course, is completely wrong, but is being propagated and disseminated by the populists, the ethno-nationalists, and the alt-right, etc. So we're talking an environment where already the conversation is full of toxic and poison conditions. Trump, of course, is one very visible element of this sort of resistance to the changing world, a world in transition. We have a world of inequality, austerity budgets that have brought people to their knees. We have a world where globalization is being demonized as well, winners and losers. And when you're demonizing, it's very easy, very quickly, to move from a discourse of humanity, as the eminence has said, to one of really, they are to blame, so let's stop them. So this context, which I've seen evolving in Europe, is really worrying, but it's also transatlantic, right? Our ethno-nationalists, our fascists and neo-Nazis are getting their inspiration and encouragement from the other side. And so obvious, guys, so obvious in the Brexit debate. I think we need to discuss that. So my question is, it doesn't have to be like this. And you said, Camino, that we're putting a lot of hope in this new commission, and we should. What is the European Commission there for? Ministers like the Maltese minister and the Austrian minister can say, look, we are elected politicians, we have to bow to public pressure. I don't believe it, but you can say that, right? In democracies, you have to sell to the public, but the European Commission has the leeway, the freedom of maneuver, if you like, to actually have a cool-headed approach to migration, to think now, when, as you said, the numbers are down, to think now about how do we actually get legal pathways, a really cool-headed arrangement for the future. To think also about refugee conventions, the Dublin Convention, and how do you rework it? Because let's look at a couple of basic facts. We've had a summer, let's call it what it is, a summer of shame. We've had a summer of tragedy and shame, and we should be, as Europeans, ashamed of what happened on our borders, the people dying. Let's also say something very clearly. We need migration. I think all of us need migration. Europe needs migration to keep up our lifestyles, right? To fill our depleted coffers, for the talent that we need. So we need that. And let's say another basic fact. The narrative on migration has been hijacked. And I think the panel here is being a bit modest and shy about saying it. It's been hijacked by the far right, by the populists, and the mainstream politicians of Europe and America have been back-footed, wrong-footed, and they're finding it very difficult to come up with a strong narrative which is actually reflective of our European values. And I would also not just blame the EPP and the conservative politicians, I would say the liberals and the so-called progressives as well. They've bought in to this debate as well, because their argument is we don't close our borders, if we don't have very strict repatriation policies, we will be buying into the far right. We will be giving them the vote. In fact, guys, when you do that, you're already behaving like the far right. So as you said, Camino, you know, it's pointless. European Fortress Europe is going to be accessed. Minister Nysel talked about commodity prices, climate change, civil wars, ethnic wars across the world. People have been on the move for centuries and will continue to do so. And the final point I'll make about the basic facts, Europe is multicultural. Look at us here. We're from all different kinds of cultures, religions, ethnicities, and we do work and live together. So this myth of us and them, basically, I think is based on very, very erroneous, misleading narratives. And finally, the right questions to ask, and the binary choice you talked about, the right questions is, why are we pandering to the far right? Why are we embarrassed to be humane? Why are we embarrassed to have a heart? And why are we embarrassed to say that Europe needs migration? Why are our business leaders not out there saying it more forcefully? Why has it been left just to the academics to say so? I would ask the media, why are you so pussyfooted by the far-right politicians? Why are you giving them the headlines? There are other people out there who have a discourse which is being ignored. Success stories, models are being ignored. I would ask also, when will we realize that we are one Europe and we have to all work together? So the binary choice, and I'll end with this, really is between selling our soul, destroying the soul of Europe, our values, or living in a world where we can still have some moral compass and still be seen as a kind of beacon on the hill, the shining light on the hill. And I'll end with a quote from an Indian author who's just written a brilliant book that I would really encourage you to read, which he says, hate, when it is fed, becomes ravenous. Hate never ends. It will always want to be fed more and more. And that, I'm afraid, is the situation we're in at the moment.
Shara, have you considered becoming a politician? Because we need more like you. You mentioned something really interesting, which is that the European Commission is an unelected body. I do disagree with that, but that's a question for another panel, possibly, which has the time and the headway to actually think about long-term solutions to migration, one of them being legal migration pathways. And that's something that obviously has been making the rounds in the policy circles for a long time. Some people consider that it's going to be the solution to irregular migration. I do disagree with that as well. But I do think that we cannot have a sustainable migration policy unless we do think about legal migration pathways to Europe. And those, you know, those include many different modalities like vocational training, sort of working arrangements and the likes. And actually, this brings me to Matteo, because I know that you've been doing some work on this and that you know a little bit about these models of legal migration pathways. So, because we know that thinking of migration just as a short-term security question is going to bring us nowhere, precisely because of the civil war, climate change, sort of geographical, geopolitical, economic considerations that we've heard about. We need to think about legal migration pathways which work, again, both for host and sending societies, which I think is the most difficult part of the whole system. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So given that I'm probably the last, right, to talk.
We still have a minute.
No, I'm not. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, let me try to pull some.
You still have 5 minutes like everybody else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I aim to be shorter, but Shara said, if I may, the narrative is being hijacked, but I think it's true, and it's also not just because we tap into fear, you know, into emotions. It's also because there is a lack in the media, but also from us as academics, a lack of cool-headed, evidence-based analysis on some facts that are very important. So let me say 3 things that I think are important. Maybe I will not get into detail, but the 3 main things that we should look into when we talk about safe and legal pathways. The first is safe pathways, which is also for the short term, not just long term. Well, we have heard, you all have heard about the pull factor hypothesis, right? If we go save people at sea, then people will depart more. It is interesting. It is a totally logical conclusion. The fact is, we have 2 studies coming up in the next few months showing that there doesn't seem to be huge support in terms of evidence to this hypothesis, and nobody has tried to test it in these past 5 years. It is interesting because we need to test it. It might be so logical that we don't need to, but I can tell you we have evidence for the past 6 years, from 2014 to today, that the pull factor, if it is there, so if we go rescuing them, they will depart more, is, if it is there, it is a very small effect compared to many others. And we have papers coming up, me and a co-author, the first, and a second one, I still have to find co-authors, which go into very, sharp detail, monthly data and daily data. It doesn't seem to be there. So I was shocked as well, but we need to look at the data and then ask ourselves, is it there? And this brings us to humane solutions, because sometimes we think it's a trade-off between going, say, rescuing them and, let's say, avoid the people depart, and so put their lives at risk. Apart from the fact that this is not exactly totally logical, because people in Libya are at risk, but anyway, if they do not depart more, then we might have a third way that we have to look into, and nobody has even just attempted to do that, try to find that proper balance between search and rescue and avoiding that everyone departs from Africa and we're invaded, which is important actually, and this is the first point. Second thing, when we talk about legal access to Europe, we often forget a very important thing, which is legal stay. We have 22 million foreigners in Europe right now. This means, in the ballpark figure, about 10% of these, 10% of this figure is another 2.5 million people who might be undocumented right now in Europe. Okay? This figure is probably even higher because people are being rejected from the asylum procedures and they are not being returned. Okay? And we have to find a solution which is feasible for these persons. Most of the people who are here will not be returned. In Italy, just to give you an example, we have around 600,000 undocumented persons living right now. We are returning 6,000 of them, okay, each year. It means it will take a century to return them all. So we have to find solutions, and there is an easy solution. It comes with costs, at least political costs. It is regularization. It doesn't mean that we have to regularize all, but we have to find criteria so that people who are already here, will not be returned in the foreseeable future, have a future here. They can work, they can pay taxes, they can be integrated. Remember that people who are undocumented in Italy, at least, we have data on that, are 20 times more at risk of committing crimes. Simply they are marginalized. Undocumented status is the most important factor for criminality. Okay? And third thing, and I conclude, it's really legal pathways. And let me give you some data as well. If you come to Europe as a humanitarian migrant, you have a very different prospect in Europe rather than if you come here as a labor migrant. Let me give you one figure which is probably shocking. If you come to Europe as a labor migrant, in the first 5 years, so after the 5 years they are here, you will be employed 80% of the time. So 8 persons out of 10 will be employed, okay, after 5 years here, okay? So you have time for your asylum process. So if you're a humanitarian migrant, you have time for your asylum process to go on and conclude. So you would expect, what happens to humanitarian migrants? So those who are refugees, who have another protection status, do they get there? Do they get 80% employment status? Do you know what the figure is? 25%. So after 5 years, just 1 in 4 refugee is employed in Europe. In Germany, it's a bit higher. I think it's 35% right now, after spending 20 billion euros per year since 2015, right, to integrate persons. You really have different prospects. And when you force labor migrants, persons that will come to Europe to work, into the asylum channel because there are no other legal channels to get there, you almost make them humanitarian migrants, because as they move, they accumulate traumas, they lose years of schooling, they lose a lot of stuff. They come here and they are much less likely to be integrated in Europe, okay? So just to give you the last figure, in Italy, we've had 250,000 people each year coming to Italy, and labor migrants are just 10,000. All the others are other channels. They come for reunification, family reunification, or through the humanitarian channel. That's a huge missed opportunity just for fear that they will steal our jobs. We have also research on that. It doesn't seem to be the case, at least even in Italy, apart from from some specific local markets. So anyway, this is important. And this also would make EASO's office and probably national offices work easier because they do not clog up the asylum system with unsubstantiated claims of those persons who just hope to stay in Europe, come here to work, and then will find themselves undocumented. So that's just the last thing. If we do not open up legal channels, then we are simply abiding by the narrative that they cannot come, they will come anyway, and in the end, they will not be able to integrate here. Thanks.
You're basically trying to get Nina out of job. So, Matteo, you talk a lot about how it's not only about coming to Europe, but it's also about staying in Europe and in which sort of circumstances. Working being the most obvious way to integrate for working-age population. And that actually brings me to a question that is not often discussed in migration debates, but it's actually very important, especially for this part of Europe, which is immigration. I'm Spanish, so I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, but so basically people live in their countries and the big problem of brain drain. This part of Europe is a focus of outgoing migrants. So are some of our southern countries like Spain, Portugal. We heard about people going to seek better opportunities elsewhere. And I was wondering, Amélie, I know that you're not an expert in the region, but I also know that you have some knowledge about this idea of brain drain. And I was wondering, actually, this sort of like outgoing migration and the sort of like solidarity concept in Europe, because we see how sometimes it's difficult for some countries in the European Union to actually accept refugees while actually expecting to get some other sort of perks from EU membership. How do we tie these two things together? How can we perhaps fit this idea of solidarity and brain drain together?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm talking from actually two perspectives. The first one is that I'm here representing a structure which is a think and do tank, independent one, working for youth and innovation in many aspects. And second one, because I'm coming from political sciences, and maybe there's an occasion to rethink what actually really means crisis and the importance of the wording. On the European level, we often talk actually about like mutual confidence between member states and also solidarity. And I picked maybe some keywords that has been discussed, which is like this emotion, the politics of fear, and actually the political will, of course, that we're talking about many times on the political level, and also the question of political cultures and communication. So when we assess actually the whole question, what happens within the European Union for youth and how actually to assess the opportunity that lies behind regarding brain drain, I would say, first of all, of course, we have to rethink European cooperation regarding local and regional authorities that have maybe now the perfect opportunity to have actually a strategy for prevention of brain drain, meaning that the sending states, of course, have a responsibility to change the crisis towards a opportunity for more regional and local action, meaning that we have, of course, a need for awareness. We need more communication on the political level within, for example, this region and in Europe in general, not only towards the civil society, but also actually for identifying the risks and the talents that a certain region needs, together with institutions and several authorities, meaning that we have so many possibilities and measures nowadays to assess which talents do we need in a certain region. How can we actually assess the different players and synergies of resources that we have, and how can we actually create a pool of talents and innovation within a region in Europe and connected regions. All those actually key driving sectors are so important for our economy, and the identification actually of the necessary specializations. How can we rethink maybe cooperation between universities and different structures in Europe? How can we work together? And this is actually a perfect moment to create better conditions for our European political cultures and for our identities and for our values, what has just been said actually. When we think actually of the huge opportunity and the huge loss of talents that we all the time permit in a certain way, how can we tackle and how can we create new structures for creating better conditions for young people? Because that's actually the big issue and the stake here when we talk about migration and refugees. And this approach actually leads me another time towards actually the real significance of crisis. We talk about all the time, okay, we create fears and we have problems actually of really communicating to civil society. And when we talk about solidarity, of course we need more solidarity, but how can we actually really come back towards the opportunity of assessing a good communication also on a member state level? How can we communicate to people, okay, what happened in Germany was great, but there were also many problems afterwards, and other neighboring countries reacted completely differently. For example, in France, we had many issues after 2015 only for communicating the real problems that we had on a political and a societal level. And we don't understand actually real issues and which opportunities lie behind actually. And brain drain is not communicated at all as a opportunity. We have really to focus more on the member state level and on the civil society level on youth and innovation.
Thank you very much. I think actually that's one of the main problems the European Union has, not only about migration, but about everything else when it comes to communicating. We are not very good at marketing ourselves. So I'm completely behind schedule, as I knew I was going to be, because again, 7 panelists plus a keynote listener. So I now have a little more than 20 minutes. I'm going to allow 5 extra minutes of the session, if you don't mind, for Q&A and for Martijn's takeaway. So what I'm going to do is, Martijn, I'm going to ask you to spend no more than 5 minutes. I know that this is really difficult, to give us an overview of what you think have been the main running themes of the discussion in this panel, and also your thoughts. Again, I'm going to be really strict with time because I want to bring the audience in, and otherwise it's going to be very difficult. So if you can do that in 5 minutes, and I know that you can, that would be really good.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and also for giving me the opportunity to have something for the first time. I've been working 20 years on migration. It's the first time I'm a keynote listener. And it's impossible to reflect anything in a decent way what has been discussed here. When I started working, when I studied and I finalized my study, my topic of my thesis was the harmonization of European immigration policies in 1998. And if you look from that perspective, a lot has happened. But one basic question, and that's what I feel from all the discussion, has not been answered. And instead of in 2015 having heads of state discussing who gets 5,000, 2,000, 4,000 people in relocation, the real discussion in Europe should have been, what do we want to reach? What is the objective of Europe's migration policy, and what is Europe's protection policy objective? What do we want? What role do we want to play? And we've never been able to answer that question. That makes it very difficult to come to a common narrative. Europe, as we have heard, there's a lot of problems in what we have done, what is going on in Europe. But there's a lot of things which are also going right. Europe, when you get a status in Europe, you now do get full protection. And at some point, you get full residency permit. And there's large populations in the world where people did not get narrative. So instead of saying, oh, last year we saved, or the last 4 years, we saved 600,000 lives in the Mediterranean, which is a very disputable figure to use it like that, we should say last year or the last 4 years, hundreds of thousands of people status, they got a job. So narrative, the point that we have said, we can change that a lot. And while a lot of the population in Europe, let's say 20, 25%, has maybe a more racist or xenophobic trend, the vast majority of Europe has not. And you see that in all elections, you see that even when the European Parliament elections, it was not so bad. But okay, we play with words, and we play with a narrative, we play long policies with a long-term impact are being adopted, which actually only have a purpose of having a headline the next day in the newspaper. Those policies, you can feel the impact in 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, sometimes only in a generation, if you cut down the benefit. That you brought up. It was a very rich discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. I think that you did reflect a lot of the questions and some that we didn't actually get into in depth as much as I would have liked to, like the relationship with Africa. But again, an hour and a half migration and 7 panelists. It's an interesting challenge. Now I'm going to open the floor to the audience. If you could help me with very short, to-the-point questions and actually asking 1 or 2 panelists and letting us know who you are and who you represent, that would be really useful. Yeah. Can we have a microphone here? Yes. Or perhaps you can try if you speak loud enough.
Thank you. All right. My name is Montserrat Fishes, and I am the regional representative for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And I will actually not follow quite your instructions because I don't have questions, but I have something to say. And the first thing I'd like to say is that I think that there's a misunderstanding here, because we started by saying that this discussion was going to be about migration. And I would say that the discussion has been about migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. I think it's very important that we make this distinction. Now, let's be clear. They're all human beings. They all have needs, as it has been, I think, very clearly put forward by both His Eminence and by Shaira. Very clear. All human beings, all have dignity, all need support, all deserve compassion. Nobody deserves to die when trying to reach Europe or any other part of the world. But they are not the same thing. For starters, because there is no agreed definition of who is a migrant. Who is a migrant? The one who tried to cross the Mediterranean now? Somebody who goes from here to the US to marry somebody? Somebody who comes and stays in Italy or in Slovenia for studying purposes? Anybody can be a migrant that way. But there is an agreed definition of who is a refugee. And there is a particular element that has to be highlighted and never forgotten, which is persecution. Refugees are people who are persecuted for who they are, for what they believe, for what they represent, for the color of their skin, maybe for their sexual orientation. They are persecuted. And as such, they have rights. Nobody has the right to migrate. But everybody has the right to seek asylum. And the states have the obligation to provide asylum. Here is the difference. And I think it's very important that we keep that in mind, because states have an obligation towards refugees. Anyone, any country that wants to join the European Union must sign and ratify the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. Without it, they cannot be members of the EU. So it's important to keep that in mind. And it's important because, as His Eminence has mentioned, if we want to stop mopping the floor, we have to turn the tap off. I think that's a very apt metaphor. And if we want to turn the tap off, we need to understand why people are coming. And if we do not make the distinction, how are we going to address the root causes? So it is really important. And it is for that reason also that, like the Minister said, and very appropriately, there is a global compact on migration. But there is also a global compact on refugees, because they are different, because the needs are different. And because of that, in the global compact, the key, one of the many key points is actually addressing the root causes. And that means providing support to the countries of origin, but also to the host countries, and also providing support eventually for the return of people, and while they're in here, to help them integrate. So I know that this is truly, I would say, a very selected audience and a very selected group of panels. And I think that it's important that we are clear about that, because if we are not clear, it's going to be even less clear for the public at large. And it is indeed now a reality that more and more populist governments and media and others are purposely blurring the two concepts, calling refugees migrants. And from there, there's the next step, calling them illegal migrants, meaning that they are criminals. And there's just the next step to call them terrorists. And hence, there's a clear jump between a terrorist and a refugee?
No, absolutely. I do acknowledge the conflation here, but the only thing that I have to say for myself and for my panel is that the question of migration, again, in an hour and a half, having to touch upon legal migration, refugees, asylum seekers, and everything is a complex matter. But I do take your points into consideration. I don't know if somebody in the panel wants to reflect on this, perhaps with a comment on the global compact on migration and refugees. Minister, you were talking about that yesterday, and about how much backlash you had to actually face at home because of signing the compacts.
Well, I think it boils down also to communication, how we communicate. Rightly so, you mentioned the distinction. At times we don't do the distinction. But it's also, broadly speaking, not only on the points that you raised, but also on how we communicate. For example, we mentioned the Global Compact, which is a non-binding document. So even that to convince some who were evidently very much against that we endorsed this document, which is, after all, in a nutshell, what we believe as a country and what we have been trying to do for a number of years. So I dare say we had no alternative, because it was part and parcel of what we believe and what we were and we are still doing, actually. So lack of communication leads to different ideas and misconceptions. And this is a challenge also for the European Union, how to communicate. And I think we need to have a balanced approach to the issue of migration, of migrants, of refugees, because we tend to mix everything in the same sentence without doing any kind of distinction. But this is an issue that, well, of course, in an hour and a half, we're not going to tackle all the points. For example, I'm a firm believer that we should work more with our African partners as partners. So we should approach the African countries not because we have an issue of migrants coming to Europe from that region, but because we need to engage on all aspects. And I think that changing the narrative also within the European Union on Africa will help also us Europeans to maybe find some solutions for our internal problems and challenges that we have as well, through working with the African continent. Yes, then the issue of migration will be challenged, other issues will be challenged, but I say indirectly and not directly, because at times we do not, or we are not seen as approaching the African continent as partners. So I think there are a number of things that were mentioned also by our great listener, actually, and because I hate to say that, to refer to certain politicians as populists. I think we should say that these are extremists, not populists. I hope that by populists you mean something is popular, or the ideas are popular. I hope that they are not. So let's call them as extremists, that they have extreme ideas that are not mainstream and should never be mainstream. But it's a question of also communicating, and I end here, better our narrative that we need to build. I think that's why when I mentioned that European Union is not approaching this issue holistically, I meant also that we have people coming to Europe, whether we call them migrants, refugees, let's not go there, but we have people coming to Europe. We have economies that are growing, and therefore we need more workers, but we are not even considering that maybe this might be an opportunity for our economies to continue to grow, because we are having workers coming to Europe. So that's what I meant exactly when I said, well, we need to have a holistic approach also on this, but we are looking at migration only and labeling it as negative all the time, where there are elements that can be considered as positive. And I agree, of course, with what His Eminence said. If we take Libya, for example, and the current situation there, we know that there is a UN arms embargo, but at the same time we know that this embargo is being arms are going in all the time. So, you know, and then we say we have migrants leaving Libya, of course. I mean, if they see more ammunition coming in, more armaments coming in, I think everyone will escape not to risk their life. So it's one thing that is leading to the other, and that is maybe our narrative when it comes to not just the migration issue or policy, but we have to talk about the broader narrative that also we need to tackle issues that are leading to people leaving or seeking a better future elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Minister. If somebody else wants to ask a question, please catch my eye now. But first I'm going to bring Ms. Kneissl because she wanted to say something. Yes, just so that I can organize my time. Are there more questions? So there's a question over there, just a sec. There's a question over there, there's a question here. If you want to speak, do it now or shut up forever, as they say. So I have two questions. I'm going to bring the two questions in, then Ms. Kneissl, and then I really want the panelists to have a minute to wrap up. So I'm going to be really brutal with time. Short questions, to the point, please, and specific panelists if possible. Thank you. Yeah?
You can find us at the coffee break as well.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Jana. I come from Caritas Slovenia. We implement development cooperation project and humanitarian project in Global South. So I would just like to give a comment, or also if someone from the panelists have it. I think we should also focus on more solidarity with Global South, with Africa and other developing countries, because we should know that there is the most migration in the world within African continent. So they need our support, our development aids. I am also monitoring our project in sub-Saharan Africa, and I spoke with many people. If there would be peace, if they will have the condition for dignified life, job opportunities, they would not move. They will be not forced to move and leave their home. So I think that solidarity, beside the welcoming those who suffer in Europe, there should be also more solidarity with Africa.
Good, thanks so much. Question here? Yes. Say your name and your affiliation, please.
Sergo Manashvili, Senior Advisor at the ICMPD International Center for Migration Policy Development. Migration is also about international politics, and we are lucky to have so many eminent representatives of foreign affairs. So my question is for the next commission, for instance, it will remain also very much external dimension, issue of migration. And you, Minister, said there was a consensus on this topic. I would be very much interested to hear what is the consensus for the moment, or what should be the consensus on three main transit countries, Libya, Morocco, and Turkey. How do we fix Libya? How do we approach Morocco? And how do we approach Turkey? And two main source countries, Syria and Afghanistan. So what is your take, you, Madam Kneissl, as well, and all the panelists? Thank you.
Thanks so much. So Ms. Kneissl, perhaps you want to tip in with the comment that you had. And I invite the panelists to actually also comment on Sergei's question on Syria, Libya, Morocco. Well, we never know. And Turkey and Afghanistan, yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me start first with your question because it hooks up on what I wanted to say, role of the Mediterranean. I studied Arabic and Hebrew in the early 80s, and I was privileged in the situation that I could travel at a time when there was still a sense of curiosity on all sides, being curious for the other. I know the harsh criticism on Orientalists as such, and I consider myself somehow an Orientalist, but the Orientalists, in contrast to the so-called Middle East experts of today, they learned the language and they traveled. We neither have today people who still master the languages. I may say, yes, I speak Arabic, I understand Farsi, and I speak Hebrew. And that has always enabled me to also develop true conversations. And I met people on the other sides of the eastern, of the Levant or of the Maghreb, who also mastered very well 2, 3, 4 languages of the other side, if you may say. And there was this knowledge of the other's literature, poetry, music. It also had to do, of course, with a much more secular world which we're in. And this is maybe also a factor that comes to it. People who fled Algeria in the 1990s and who are intrigued by this rise of extreme Islamism, they find their countries of destination today in Europe. They fled for the reasons, and they will find similar people in today's districts where they have built up a second life. So this sense of curiosity, this wish to travel, that was among professional or non-professional Orientalists and people who were curious from all sides. This is not anymore the case today. Also, when we go back to 1995 Barcelona process, and I would like to remind you of the fact Barcelona process in December 1995, it all started because the main motivation was migration. And one of the immediate results of the Barcelona process were the EU association agreements with with the MENA countries, Middle East and North Africa. When you speak to people in responsibility today, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Tunisia, they will say the EU association agreements harshly affected our economies. We don't want to see more of that. So it all created even more unrest, more instability also. One of the many reasons what led to the 2011 revolts. Yes, we had economic growth in Egypt. There was 4.6% economic growth in October 2010, but that didn't mean that people enjoyed what they were looking for. Today, 7 years after the revolts, when the UNDP asked questions, what do you look for, freedom of speech or security? It's all security in these countries. So the EU association agreements didn't yield the results people wanted in 1995. Against the backdrop of migration, keep people in their countries of origin. We have all had that for the last 25 years. In the sense of countries of origin, I myself translated a lot in 2014-15 in refugee shelters, and people who claimed to be Syrians were not Syrians. You don't have to be a big mastermind, but you just have to know some of the dialects. And there were people from Egypt who claimed to be Syrians. There were people who lived in Lebanon who found out that they had a Syrian great-grandfather, and so on. I don't see these countries as, a country like Syria, for instance, as a main source of migration. Where I see it much more is Southern Asia, as was mentioned, because of the demographic pressure and because of the much higher sense of mobility that we have in those parts of the world, in particular also because of the better command of English. You have a better command of English in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, than you have in most African or North African countries. And here is the desire to go to the other Anglo-Saxon part of the world for the sake of finding work, of creating a better life, or whatever other reason. And here, I think the disappearance of secular mindset, the disappearance of this curiosity and of a genuine knowledge, I don't see it anymore. I see today a lot of Middle East experts, a lot of migration experts, and so on, but rare are those who have really lived in the countries. Yes, they might have traveled to the Sheraton and to the Carlton in the respective capital, but who have really lived and who master the language and who know what they are talking about.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're the only thing standing between you and coffee, so I'm going to have to wrap it up here. The last thing that I wanted to do before I let you all free for a cup of coffee and perhaps for a chat with our panelists, if there are questions which haven't been answered like yours, I'm sorry for that, is to bring in the panelists for last thoughts. And this is a game I want to suggest. So Ms. von der Leyen, who is going to be the president of the European Commission, is a very busy woman, but she has a major problem to solve, which is the migration narrative in Europe. She's coming to you, to all of you, for a 1 minute sort of like advice of what to do about this problem. Again, she's very, very busy, so she only has 1 minute. In 1 minute each, what would you advise von der Leyen, starting now from Amelie?
Yeah, thank you. 1 minute. I would actually begin with a narrative which is very grassrooted, as you may say, an approach coming from more cooperation within Europe, with the neighboring countries, and to have a policy within the European Union that gives more power to structures such as universities or think tanks or actually non-political institutions of the European Union to have more freedom, innovation capacities, and capacity building activities to actually engage on the ground for the people in the regions which actually are affected not only by all those problems that were just actually mentioned, but to change the narrative from crisis to opportunity, regional opportunity, to have cooperation on the international level, of course. We need that. We all know that the European Union needs to enhance the dialogue and diplomacy. In that sense, migration being an international phenomenon that we
And
have.
the minute is over, I'm sorry. Ms. von der Leyen has to go to the next.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, this is just a funny game.
1 minute.
Ms. Neisel.
When it comes to internal EU migration, freedom of movement, it's all about fiscal equal standards. We do not have something that's closest to a fiscal union, so as long as you have flat tax regimes in one country and others in different, so there will always be a different treatment. So it's all about fiscal standards, and the other topic is also about the social security systems. Here also you need a much more higher assimilation, harmonization of security systems, because otherwise you will always have a much stronger pull factor by countries which have higher standards in social security, and people who are relocated between countries with less payoff by social security will quit those countries. So fiscality and social security.
Okay, thanks. Nina?
Thank you. Yeah, I would be much more concrete. This is how my work is, and I do hope that I will have the chance to talk about this issue, especially with the commissioner. No? So that's my job first of all. But then definitely the question is, and it's always pointing, do we have in Europe common European asylum system? Do we have this? When this is the question which is posed, of course, I would say, yes, we do. We did, like Martin said, we did develop this since 1999. We have the legal frames. We had also, of course, the tools, but do we implement that? Do the member states know how to implement it? So I think that fair communication in this respect, what was also mentioned with the panel, is crucial. So where is the problem? The problem is with convergency, the problem is with backlog, the problem is with reception conditions, the problem is with treating vulnerable groups. So these are the things which are concrete and they have to be addressed. And then we'll, of course, also come to the solidarity and mechanisms inside of Europe, which could divide or connect the countries. But if we don't take, how do we say in Slovenia, the bull for the horns, and we don't talk about the challenges, we will never get far in the migration debate and solutions.
Thanks so much, and thanks also not for not asking her for more money. Sorry, joke. Minister.
Well, Nina, eventually that will come for Nina. So, given that Ursula is very busy, I will try to tell her just this, that let's focus on a positive agenda. Let's try to have more cooperation, more partnerships with third countries. Of course, it goes without saying within the EU, the European Union itself. But since we're talking about migration and possible influx of people for any reason and in any way, so let's build a positive agenda, cooperation and partnerships with third countries, which means countries of origin, countries of transit. Let's focus on legal ways, and I think the rest will be solved on its own.
Thanks so much, Minister. His Eminence.
Okay, thank you. I think briefly, as for what the EU can do, I'll probably ask two things. Let's change the development paradigm. And let's stop referring to some part of the country as simply providers of raw material for some other parties to become the developers. So let's change the development paradigm, and with a sincere partnership, encourage equal and as it a consolidated growth. Second thing from Italy, let's find a legal way of entry into Europe for a whole lot of these people. If an individual invests a whole family fortune in trying to get to Europe, it becomes difficult for him to return without any resources. So let us legalize entry into Europe for everybody. And if you want, if people could apply for visa to enter Europe and not have to cross the desert and all of that, entry into Europe will become, will be very reduced. So let us seek to do that and implement the global, migration compact as has been decided by all.
Great. Thanks so much, Semina. Shara.
Well, I hope von der Leyen does speak to me, because Jean-Claude Juncker did, and I think it paid off sometimes. First of all, I would say to her, talk to migrants, don't just talk to me. Talk to the people you're writing about and working about. Secondly, look at the future. Don't talk about Orientalism. Don't make out-of-date distinctions between refugees and migrants. Talk about building an inclusive society. Inclusion means also looking after vulnerable in Europe who are ethnic Europeans, not just migrants and refugees. That way you get rid of the hostility. And finally, practice what you preach. Make the EU institutions slightly more diverse than they are now. You've managed to do it for women, now trying to do it for non-white Europeans.
Thank you, Shara. Matteo?
Okay, 3 things for Ursula. First, be pragmatic, offer cool-headed solutions, but always rebuild the house that the member states will continue to destroy. Just know that member states will not be on board on many of the things that you have to continue to offer to them. Second, do not pretend that member states are all on the same page. They're not.